You talked at the end about Peter Martin, the Age and Herald. You talked at the end about compensating losers to purchase reforms. You talked about the Accord, you talked about the National Competition Policy, you talked about the GST, and immediately I was thinking CRPS. Now, is that an example of what you're talking about? And if so, I guess, is it you defending that as a worthwhile thing to do? Is big compensation in order to get something through worthwhile in that case? Well, I suppose as an advisor you'd think it would be, but does it fall into that category?
Yes, it does, Peter. And actually it's not a bad illustration. The point of the carbon pollution reduction scheme, like any emissions trading scheme, is to change relative prices. Of course it changes absolute prices as well, but the point is to change relative prices. The point of the scheme itself is not to reduce the purchasing power or to reduce the real income of the people that we want to see behavioural change, where we want to see behavioural change. Thus, the construction of the CPRS in a way that changes relative prices but then gives back to households in particular, and also others, but gives back to households in particular the ability to sustain their real purchasing power, that sort of policy in concept makes sense. And indeed, and perhaps more importantly for the proponents of such a policy, without some form of compensation to maintain the real purchasing power of Australian households, it's extremely unlikely that such a policy proposal would gain political traction.
Miriam Lyons from the Centre for Policy Development. I am curious about whether or not you think that the CPRS passes the two tests that you said such compensation payments need to pass. That is, that the level of compensation is worth the value of the reform, given a 5% target, and that the payments should ease rather than hinder the transition and be designed in that way. That's one question. A second question was whether you think that the advice from the Sarkozy-Stiglitz report of producing national balance sheets is worth taking on board. So the idea that we actually produce national accounts that take a sort of assets and liabilities approach to broader measures of progress. So taking into account environmental, human capital, etc.
Yeah, I'm going to duck the first question. Make no apology for that. I imagine the legislation to which you're referring is presently being debated in the Senate. So I think I've got a good reason to duck the question. Anyway, be that as it may, the second question is for me rather more interesting. And my answer to the second question is yes. I think there is a strong case for developing national balance sheets. This is not easy work. I referred earlier to some economists, even in the early days of the national accounts, pointing to deficiencies in the national accounts, and even in those early days, this is one of the deficiencies to which they pointed, that there is no obvious link between our income statement and a national balance sheet, and of course there should be. As just one example, if a naturally occurring resource is sold, GDP records in that year in which it's sold the full value of the natural resource. I don't know, if that natural resource were occurring in your backyard and you sold the natural resource, you'd probably be reluctant to regard all of that natural resource as income in the year in which you sold it. You'd probably think that you'd sold an asset. And you'd probably, on your balance sheet, record two transactions. Cash had gone up, at least until you spend it, but your holdings of natural resources had fallen by presumably an amount of equal value. This is a challenging concept, of course, for an economy that has a relatively high endowment of naturally occurring resources. It's a challenging concept, but I think it's an important concept. We need to get our heads around this.
Eric Sidoti from the Whitlam Institute. It's a slightly different question in the sense that it seems to me a conclusion of much of what you're saying is that we have a much more complex policy formation process? If we're talking about capabilities and the relationship between the national balance sheet and what's happening with the fiscal operations. And given the Moran review of the public service, I was just wondering if there's changes that you foresee in the way policy is formed to ensure that Treasury, in its considerations, given the perspective you outline, is both informed by and inputs into other policy type of development.
I can't give a complete answer to that question. That's quite a deep question, which I haven't thought sufficiently about, and I'm involved myself in that review to which you refer, which would limit me in any event. But I'll make a couple of observations. The first is that I have found, this is a personal reflection, I have found that whenever I have got involved in thinking about policy challenges in terms of building human capability, the very first thing I've done is to get in an aeroplane and go somewhere and talk to people on the ground. I think that's instructive. I don't think that's just a coincidence. I think that is actually quite instructive. I think there is something in that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that for an agency like mine, which sits at the centre of government, we're called a central agency, nothing can be prosecuted well, even in the policy development space, before you get to implementation. Even in the policy development space, nothing can be prosecuted well without a lot of involvement of other agencies in government, horizontal level involvement in policy development. And so, and I've observed this of Treasury people, when we have got involved in Indigenous development issues, and we've got involved in education, we've got involved in health, in those three areas in particular, my people involved in those things spend an awful lot of time in other government agencies talking to what we call the line departments, and also in some areas talking to the policy implementation or delivery agencies about the way that things are working on the ground. So I think it does mean that central agencies that are committed to policy improvement in these areas, traditionally the responsibility of line agencies, they have to be prepared to roll their sleeves up, and they have to be prepared to go and talk to the people in the line agencies and the people on the ground who are affected by the decisions that are being taken. And that is, well, let me put it this way, that's probably not the sort of work that I would have seen myself doing when I first joined the Treasury a quarter of a century ago. Even then, there would have been instances of this behaviour to point to.